push your head. Push your head. Take it again. Hey.
The Niger Delta situation has reached a point where it must be treated in a holistic way. In other words, in the context of what is Nigeria.
Well, gas flaring is becoming something like an old cracking record that we've been talking about for many, many years now. And unfortunately, the government and the oil companies are pretending as if they are not hearing. But to some extent, we know they are hearing because of the way they are shifting the goalposts.
As a matter of fact, gas flaring is illegal. Gas flaring is illegal in the sense that environmentally it is not an acceptable practice all over the world.
Only me come na woman to lima. What be you am na brother? Ma we no dey go buy ma bebe yesterday. Ondo koma. Ye. Abaje. Say biri. Ogoniland. Akaso.
The Federal Republic of Nigeria, commonly referred to as Nigeria, is a federal constitutional republic in West Africa. Its coast in the south lies on the Gulf of Guinea in the Atlantic Ocean. It comprises 36 states and the Federal Capital Territory, where the capital, Abuja, is located. Nigeria is officially a democratic secular country. Modern-day Nigeria has been the site of numerous kingdoms and tribal states over the millennia. The modern states originated from British colonial rule beginning in the 19th century and the merging of the Southern Nigerian Protectorate and Northern Nigeria Protectorate in 1914. The British set up administrative and legal structures while practicing indirect rule through traditional chiefdoms. Nigeria became a formal independent federation in 1960 and plunged into a civil war from 1967 to 1970. It has since alternated between democratically elected civilian government and military dictatorships, until it achieved a stable democracy in 1999. Nigeria is often referred to as the giant of Africa, owing to its large population and economy. With approximately 182 million inhabitants, Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa and the 7th most populous country in the world. The country is viewed as a multinational state, as it is inhabited by 500 ethnic groups, of which the 3 largest are the Hausa, Igbo, and Yoruba. These ethnic groups speak over 500 different languages and are identified with a wide variety of cultures. The official language is English, although many local languages such as Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo, and Ijaw are also spoken. Nigeria is divided roughly into half between Christians who live mostly in the southern part of the country and Muslims in the northern part. A minority of the population practice a traditional religion. Its currency is the naira. Oil was discovered in Nigeria in 1956 at Oloibiri in Ogbia local government area of Bayelsa State and Ogoniland in Rivers State in 1958 respectively, after half a century of exploration. The discovery was made by Shell. Nigeria joined the rank of oil producers in 1958 when its first oil field came on stream, producing 5,000 barrels per day. After 1960, exploration rights in onshore and offshore areas adjoining the Niger Delta were extended to other foreign companies. In 1965, the EA field was discovered by Shell in shallow water southeast of Warri.
In 1956, oil was discovered in Olebri, which is Bayelsa State now. Then it was part of Eastern region. The Prime Minister, Alhaji Tafawa Balewa, sent a telegram to the Premier of the region to say you have joined the club of wealthy regions. Because of the abolition of Section 134 to 50%, we in the Niger Delta, we have never had one.
I did all that needs to be done. Before I took over, it was about 3% of what is derived from the oil money that goes back. When I took over, the 13% that was in the proposed constitution was given to them. In addition, I set up a commission entirely devoted to that place, run by their own people.
In 1970, the end of the Biafran War coincided with the rise in the world oil price, and Nigeria was able to reap instant riches from its oil production. Nigeria joined the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, in 1971 and established the Nigerian National Petroleum Company, NNPC, in 1977. A state-owned and controlled company which is a major player in both the upstream and downstream sector.
The Niger Delta situation has reached a point where it must be treated in a holistic way. In other words, in the context of what is Nigeria, what constitutes Nigeria, what are the protocols of association between the various regions? How do you actually address the issue of resource control? In other words, do you say all the resources should go to the center and then the center doles out what it wants or what it negotiates under circumstances which are not really equal, which are not egalitarian, what it considers appropriate to the various regions, or it says let each section under a genuine federal system control its own resources and pay taxes, dues, payment for common services, etc. to the center. So the center is not just fattening itself on the sweat and the loss of various regions like the Delta region.
Niger Delta is the land of gold, while the people live in pain and sorrow. Bayelsa is the land of glory. My people deserve good living. Niger Delta is the land of gold, while the people live in pain and sorrow. River State is the treasure city. My people deserve good living. For so long Niger Delta rejected, Bayelsa we are neglected. Check out the youths, we are jobless. I'm talking to Mr. President. The nation's income we bring 80%. Why should we be left in this total mess? We've been like this for so many years. Federal government never care, so we have to use firearms and fight. Now them say that style is a crime. We need good road, good water and light. That's why we stand up for we right. Niger Delta is the land of gold, while the people live in pain and sorrow.
At the time of independence was regionalism, where the regions that produced kept 50% of whatever they produced. The beneficiaries were the West that produced a huge amount of cocoa, and the North that produced a huge amount of granite, hides and skin, cotton, and other things from the North. But was abandoned. The issue of regionalism, federation, physical federalism was also set aside. In my opinion, the only agenda that should be discussed with federal government as a Niger Delta person is that we want to own and control our resources 100% and pay tax to federal government.
Apart from petroleum, Nigerians' other natural resources include natural gas, tin, iron ore, coal, limestone, lead, zinc, and arable land. Petroleum production and exports play a dominant role in Nigeria's economy and account for about 90% of our gross earnings. This dominant role has pushed agriculture, the traditional mainstay of the economy, from the early 50s and 60s to the background.
3 regions in this country, from 1953, the Western Nigeria had cocoa. The cocoa boom brought a lot of wealth to the Western region. With that, Chief Obafemi Awolowo was able to utilize the resources of his region to promote the development of that state. Ahmadu Bello was the premier of the North, with the granite pyramids, with the hides and skins, everything that at his disposal. He was able to establish Ahmadu Bello University. He was able to establish Kaduna Capital Territory. He was able to develop Kano Industrial Estate, and so forth. But what happened in the Eastern region? Palm produce was the only source of income. The price of palm oil was very low abroad. So Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, even though very well educated, most educated, could not introduce free primary education in Eastern region. This was the essence of developing at your own pace.
Major events in the history of Nigerian oil and gas started in 1908. Nigerian Bitumen Company and British Colonial Petroleum commenced operations around Okitipupa. Also in 1955, Mobil Oil Corporation started operations in Nigeria. In 1956, Shell changed name to Shell PP Petroleum Development Company of Nigeria Limited, and 1958, first shipment of oil export was embarked in Nigeria. Competition for oil wealth has fueled violence between many ethnic groups, causing the militarization of nearly the entire region by ethnic militia groups as well as Nigerian military and police forces. In view of the exploitation of the people and resources of the Niger Delta region, Jasper Adaka Boro, a chemistry graduate and one-time student union president at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, in 1964-65 session, formed the Niger Delta Volunteer Force, NDVF, and translated the struggle for self-determination and resource control, initially pursued by Chief Harold Dapapriye and his contemporaries through constitutional measures, into armed battle by unilaterally declaring independence for the region Niger Delta Republic on February 23, 1966, first in Africa. However, his NDVF was crushed after 12 consecutive days of intensive fighting with the federal troops at Imbiama River in the present River State. Following the crushing of the insurrection by the federal government, Isaac Boro, as expected, was incarcerated, tried for treason, and sentenced to death on June 21, 1966. He was later pardoned by General Yakub Gowon on August 4, 1967, along with Lieutenant.
The mystery, if I may use that word, about Isaac Boro was that vision that he had, so much that people did not see And that young man at the age of 27, you know, had examined everything, had put things in place, had traveled around the creeks of the Niger Delta in preparation for that day when, like he said, the people of the Niger Delta will show that they are tired of injustice, they're tired of oppression, that they're tired of exploitation. You know, I can say that probably that young man knew that he was not going to succeed, but it was time for him to get the world to know and to prepare for the bigger things that will come. Because 51 years after the Boro rebellion, we're still at the same level of agitation.
Major Jasper Adaka Boro was a man of the people. He had his own people in mind, and that was why he organized that revolution. The revolution was against the federal government, indicating that his own people in the Niger Delta were being oppressed and no justice done. So he wanted justice, fair play, and equity. And so he waged that war against the federal government. The intention was not to wage a full-scale war against the federal government. After all, he wouldn't have been able to do it. But he wanted to tell the federal government that his people were now being neglected, marginalized, while a lot of the revenue from the whole federation comes from his own area. In fact, at that time, it was not yet very big, but he knew it would be big. He knew he would sustain the economy of this country later. And so he wanted that justice to be done. And so one of the primary objectives or aims of his revolution was to ensure that we have a fair share of the revenue. That is resource control. Resource control may not only border on financial benefits, but so many things that will border on that: education, infrastructure, and everything, you know, bordering on resource control, which we were denied. Up till now, 13% is not enough, but he wanted much more for the Niger Delta.
The movement for the survival of the Ogoni people, MOSOP, was formed in 1992. MOSOP, spearheaded by Ogoni playwright and author Ken Saro-Wiwa, became the major campaigning organization representing the Ogoni people in their struggle for ethnic and environmental rights. Its primary targets and at times adversaries have been the Nigerian government and Royal Dutch Shell. The current conflict in the Niger Delta arose in the early 90s over tensions between foreign oil corporations and a number of Niger Deltans' minority ethnic groups who felt they are being exploited, particularly the Ogonis and the Ijaws. Ethnic and political unrest has continued throughout the 90s despite the conversion to democracy and the election of Obasanjo's government in 1999.
I'm acquainted with a number of them. They come to see me, they write to me, they send me emails. I know their spokespeople. I know young members. I know one of them who's even a poet and who's so charged with the entire injustice of generations. Now, these are the sort of people we're dealing with. They're not just criminals. Well, of course, there are criminal elements. Any kind of liberation struggle, you'll have the criminal elements who'll kidnap for money, for ransom, purely vicious elements. But you're dealing with a very serious, intelligent organization.
From 2004, violent hit also oil industries with piracy and kidnappings. In 2009, a presidential amnesty program accompanied with support and training of ex-militants proved to be a success.
I hereby grant amnesty and unconditional pardon to all persons who have directly or indirectly participated in the commission of offences associated with militant activities in the Niger Delta.
Thus, until 2011, victims of crimes were fearful of seeking justice for crime committed against them because of a failure to prosecute those responsible for human rights abuses.
The beneficiary of the amnesty program is the federal government, the oil companies, and to a large extent, all the 36 state governments, because all of them are collecting allocation. As a matter of fact, the only reason why the amnesty program is still ongoing is because the program has not finished training the identified and documented number of people since 2010, when the amnesty program really kicked off. Even though it was accepted in 2009, the program actually started kicking off in 2010. 7 years into the program, they have not even ended the training of the figure that they have registered, which they tell us is 30,000. So that's why first the amnesty program is still on. The amnesty program is not a developmental program or a regional developmental program. The amnesty program is purely a program for a number of people who agreed not to carry arms again for whatever their reasons were when they first picked up arms, and to find a way to get jobs, to get employment for themselves. So that is the program that is known as amnesty program. Amnesty program is not effective for people who are not included in the 30,000. Therefore, you have millions of teeming Niger Delta youths that are unemployed, that have no hope of being employed, and that have capacity to arm themselves the same way the others arm themselves to get attention to whatever they feel they must get attention for.
Nigeria, after nearly 4 decades of oil productions, had by the early 80s became almost completely dependent on petroleum extractions economically, generating 25% of its GDP. This has since risen up to 60% as of 2008. Despite the vast wealth created by petroleum, the benefits have been slow to trickle down to the majority of the population, who since the 1960s have increasingly been forced to abandon their traditional agricultural practices. Annual production of both cash and food crop dropped significantly in the latter decades of 20th century. Cocoa production dropped by 43%. Nigeria was the world's largest cocoa export in 1960. Rubber dropped by 29%, cotton by 65%, and groundnut by 64%. In spite of the large number of skilled, well-paid Nigerians who have been employed by the oil companies, the majority of Nigerians, and most especially the people of Niger Delta State, have become poorer since the 1960s.
Predominantly, we are fishermen and farmers. Our people are farmers. In fact, we were not importing food. So surprisingly, we are now importing food like beans, yam, and other things from the north. But however, we still plant plantain, cocoyam, water yam as they call it, and potato. We still plant, but not enough for us to eat. Some of them must have to come from outside in order to keep us going. Cassava too is prominent. We are farmers.
The 1970s and 1980s saw the government's empty promises of benefit for the Niger Delta people fall through, with the Jaw and Ogoni growing increasingly dissatisfied and their environment, social and economic apparatus rapidly deteriorating.
As a matter of fact, gas flaring is illegal. Gas flaring is illegal in the sense that environmentally it is not an acceptable practice all over the world. So it is illegal. But it is still being carried out in Nigeria, knowing fully well the dangers and the harms that they are causing our livelihood, the air we breathe, the soil we use to grow our food, all the destruction that is associated with gas flaring doesn't bother the oil companies, and the federal government really does not also give a damn.
It is very embarrassing and shameful that Nigeria is second only to Russia in flaring of gas, wasting the resource of the people and at the same time poisoning the people and increasing climate change problems. So we are of the view that the government has not been serious. The people themselves have not taken it up to the point that since environment was one of the major planks that was used by agitators in the Niger Delta, we had expected that the environment would have remained on the front burner, whether amnesty or not, to the point that we will say enough is enough. Even if the whole of the Niger Delta will stage a protest to say this thing must stop today, I will blame the government, because in climes where this gas flaring has stopped, I think the government played major roles. But our government, maybe because they are in bed with the oil companies, rent seekers, they find it difficult just to say, put off the gas flare for 6 months, let there be no oil operation until we get all the facilities necessary to take care of piping gas and then ensuring that the gas is used for domestic use, electricity, and other usages that the gas ought to be used.
I always end up saying like this, that the oil companies don't care because we're black, and the federal government does not care because it's Niger Delta. So whichever way, we're just at the receiving end of the wickedness that is perpetrated, all in the name of chasing the almighty oil and gas dollar.
Solution-wise, we have been harping on the fact that gas flaring should stop. The gas should be piped and used for domestic purposes and for export, even for electricity. A few days ago, they were complaining, even when the acting president visited Bayelsa, they complained that because of attacks on oil facilities, pipelines, there was shortage in gas, and so that is affecting electricity. Now, this gas has been there since, and they are flaring it, wasting it. But when there is little problem in the Niger Delta in the form of agitation, they will say, because of that agitation, we have lost so billions. Because of that agitation, we have lost this, we have lost that. What about the times of relative peace?
Nigeria was the world's 10th largest oil exporter. This abundance in oil reserve have resulted in widespread exploitations. The Niger Delta region encompasses about 8% of Nigeria's land mass. The Niger Delta is the largest wetland region on the African continent. Oil drilling in the region began in the 1950s. In the beginning, the oil drilling in the region really stimulated the Nigerian economy and was extremely beneficial to the country. Numerous multinational corporations established oil companies in the region and made a conscious effort to violate any environmental or human rights regulations. Shell began drilling in the Niger Delta region in 1956. Over time, Shell's presence in Nigeria has become more and more detrimental. These negative consequences is a result of thousands of oil spills, human rights violations, environmental destruction, and corruption. When petroleum is discharged into the soil becomes acidic, which disrupts the photosynthesis process and kills the trees because their roots are not able to attain oxygen. Moreover, the fish population has also been negatively affected by oil drilling. The region is home to over 250 different fish species. 20 of these species are found nowhere else in the world. If oil spills continues at this rate, entire species will become extinct and the entire Nigerian fishing industry will be abolished.
Talking about crude oil and gas flaring, the spills and gas flaring, they all come from the same wells. Water under, crude oil in the middle, gas on the top. And that is why when they are drilling, you see gas coming out first, then followed by oil. Then the water is there at the formation, geologically speaking. So they all have the same effect, impact on us, especially when you talk about the toxic elements. So I cannot say gas has lesser impact on our people in terms of health, both on climate change. Then if you talk about the crude oil, when it also evaporates, when it is on the surface and it evaporates, when there is so much heat from the sun, it evaporates, it also gives the same impact, negative impact to the environment and the human beings, the animals, the plants, the fauna and flora, the same way gas flaring is affecting the people and the environment. So they are one and the same. Look at the Chevron gas explosion of 16 January 2012. It had a very serious impact on the environment, to the point that whales died, dolphins died, and we saw several other dead fishes, plus those that were in throes of death when we tried to access the environment so impacted. So you can see that the Niger Delta environment has continued to be decimated in terms of aquatic life, in terms of terrestrial life, in terms of even the human beings.
But the fishing too would have been prominent, but the whole lakes and the rivers are all polluted. The oil exploration has polluted much of the water. The aquatic life has been destroyed. And with this type of thing, it is also difficult now for real fishermen even to make a good catch and take it home, except those who are living around the Atlantic coast. They can go deep into the sea and do the fishing and bring out. But those in the creeks, all aquatic life has been destroyed.
We, the Ijaw people, were very peaceful people and peace-loving people. We're people that believe in this country. We're people that our hero, Isaac Boro, fought and laid down his life for this country. And we cannot have a difference in opinion. We only ask for social justice. We only ask for fairness. If so much oil is leaving our ground, then something should come in commiseration, so that people don't say, oh, nothing is happening here, and create problem. My state, Bayelsa, has only 8 local governments. 8. And there are states that have 25, 30, 40, 44, and so on. 8 local governments is like a joke, and that is not fairness and level of political social justice.
We intend to collaborate with the oil companies. I've held a series of meetings with them, and we want to work with them and other agencies, NESREA, NNPC, and the Ministry of Environment, and all other stakeholders. The government alone will not be able to carry out an effective remediation. We need the partnership, we need the support of all agencies, particularly the oil companies and NNPC, and the federal agencies, and also donor agencies. And I intend to make that a very strong case.
The oil and gas sector account for about 35% of gross domestic product, and petroleum export revenue represents over 90% of total export revenue. Today, the Nigerian nation is boiling and asking whoever has an answer to tell them if crude oil is a curse or a blessing to the nation and its inhabitants.
Yeah. I said, push your head. Push your head. Take it again. Hey. Adom. Yeah, bro, see.